Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to another episode of Mortica Presents FREDtime Stories. On this show, I will be reading short horror stories from both up-and-coming authors and horror legends. In case you didn't know, I am your host, Dead Fred. I am also the voice of the horror-inspired rock band, Mortica. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a like, a comment, and hitting the bell notification so you never miss a new episode. If you'd like to support the show and the band, please consider joining our Patreon page. For just $5 a month, you can have access to behind the screams footage and early access to merchandise and music. Also, don't forget to follow us on all of our social media accounts. The links are in the description. Now, without further ado, let's get into tonight's reading. Tonight's reading is a sequel of sorts to a Stephen King classic. This one is called One for the Road. It was 10:15. Herb Tooklander was thinking of closing for the night when the man in the fancy overcoat and the white, staring face burst into Tukey's bar, which lies just northern part of Falmouth. It was the 10th of January, just about the time most folks are learning to live comfortably with all the New Year's resolutions they broke, and there was one hell of a nor'easter blowing outside. 6 inches had come down before dark, and it had been going hard and heavy ever since. Twice we had seen Billy Larrabee go by high in the cab of the town plow. The second time, Tukey ran out and brought him a beer. An act of pure charity, my mother would have called it. Billy told him we were keeping ahead of the main road, but the side ones were closed, and apt to stay that way till morning. The radio in Portland was forecasting another foot and 40-mile-an-hour winds to pile up the drifts. There was just Tukey and me in the bar, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, and watched it dance the fire around in the hearth. "Have one for the road, Booth," Tukey said. "I'm gonna shut her down." He poured me one and himself, and that's when the door cracked open and this stranger staggered in, snow up to his shoulders and in his hair, like he had just rolled around in confectioner's sugar. The wind billowed a sand-fine sheet of snow in after him. "Close the door," Tukey roared at him. "Was you born in a barn?" I've never seen a man who looked that scared. He was like a horse that just spent an afternoon eating fire nettles. His eyes rolled towards Tukey, and he said, "My wife, my daughter," and he collapsed on the floor in a dead faint. "Holy Joe," Tukey says. "Close the door, Booth, would you?" I went and shut it, and pushed it against the wind was something of a chore. Tukey was down on the knee, holding the fella's head and patting his cheeks. I got over to him and saw right off that it was nasty. His face was fiery red, and there were gray blotches here and there. When you've lived through Maine winters since the time of Woodrow Wilson, you know those gray blotches mean frostbite. "Fainted," Tukey said. "Get the brandy off the back bar, will you?" I got it and came back. Tukey opened it in his fellow's coat. He came around a little, his eyes half open, and he muttered something too low to catch. "Pour a capful," Tukey says. "Just a cap?" I asked him. "That stuff's dynamite," Tukey says. "No sense overloading his carb." I poured out a capful and looked at Tukey. He nodded. "Straight down the hatch." I poured it down. It was a remarkable thing to watch. The man trembled all over and began to cough. His face got redder. His eyelids, which had been at half-mast, flew up like window shades. It was a bit alarming, but Tukey only sat him up like a big baby and clapped him on the back. The man started to retch, and Tukey clapped him again. "Hold on to it. That brandy comes dear." The man coughed some more, but it was diminishing now. I got my first good look at him. City fellow, all right, and from somewhere south of Boston, I guess. He was wearing kids' gloves, expensive but thin. There were probably some more of those gray, whitish patches underneath on his hands, too, and he would have been lucky not to lose a finger or two. His coat was fancy, all right, a $300 job if I've ever seen one. I had been wearing tiny little boots that hardly came up to his ankles. I began to wonder about his toes. "Better," he said. "All right," Tookie said. "Come over by the fire." "My wife and daughter," he said. "They're out there, in the storm." "From the way you came in, I figured they weren't home watching the TV," Tookie said. "You can tell us by the fire, easy as here on the floor. Hook on, Booth." He got to his feet, with a little groan came out of him, and his mouth twisted down in pain. I wondered about his toes again, and I wondered why God felt that he would make fools from New York who try to drive through a southern Maine snowstorm. And I wonder if his wife and little girl were dressed warmer than he is. We hiked him across to the fireplace and sat him down in the rocker that used to be Mrs. Tookie's, until she passed in '74. It was Mrs. Tookie's who was responsible for this place. She had been written up and down in Easton's Sunday Telegram, and even once in the Sunday supplement of the Boston Globe. It was really more of a public house than a bar, with its big wooden floor, pegged rather than nailed, maple bar, the old barn-rafted ceilings, and the monstrous big fieldstone hearth. Mrs. Tookie started to get the idea in her head of Down East article came out and wanted to start calling the place Tookie's Inn or Tookie's Rest. I admit it was some sort of a colonial ring to it, but I prefer plain old Tookie's Bar. It's one thing to get uppish in the summer when the state's full of tourists, another thing altogether in the winter, when you and your neighbors have to trade together. And there had been plenty of winter nights, like this one, that Tookie and I had spent all alone, drinking scotch and water, maybe even just a few beers. My own Victoria passed in '73, and Tookie's was the place where we would go where there was just enough voices to mute the steady ticking of the death watch beetle. Even if it was just Tookie and me, it was enough. I wouldn't have felt the same if the place had been called Tookie's Rest. It's crazy, but true. We got this fellow in front of the fire, and he got the shakes harder than ever. He hugged onto his knees, his teeth clattered together, a few drops of clear mucus spilled out from his nose. I think he was starting to realize that another 15 minutes out there, he would have been dead. It's not the snow, it's the wind chill. Steals your heat. "Where'd you go off the road?" Tookie asked him. 6 miles south of here," he said. Tookie and I stared at each other, and all of a sudden I felt cold. Cold all over. "You sure?" Tookie demanded. "You came 6 miles through the snow?" He nodded. "I checked the odometer when we came through town. I was following directions, going to see my wife's sister in Cumberland. Never been there before. We're from Jersey." New Jersey. If there's anything more purely foolish than a New Yorker, it's a fellow from New Jersey. 6 miles, you sure?" Tookie demanded. "Pretty sure, yeah. I found the turnoff, but it was drifted in. It was..." Tookie grabbed him. In the shifting glow of the fire, his face looked pale and strained, older than his 67 years by 10. "You made a right turn?" "Right turn, yeah. My wife..." "Did you see a sign?" "A sign?" He looked up at Tookie blankly and wiped the end of his nose. "Of course I did. It was on my instructions. Take Jointer Ave through Jerusalem's lot to the 295 entrance ramp." He looked from Tookie and me and Tookie again. Outside, the wind whistled and howled and moaned through the eaves. "Wasn't that right, mister?" "The lot," Tookie said. It was almost too soft to hear. "Oh, my God." "What's wrong?" the man said. His voice was rising. "Wasn't that right? I mean, the road looked drifted in, but I thought if there's a town there, the plows would be out, and then I just sort of..." He just sort of trailed off. "Booth," Tookie said to me, low, "get on the phone. Call the sheriff." Sure, this fool from Jersey said. That's all right. What's wrong with you guys anyway? You look like you seen a ghost. Tukey said, No ghosts in the lot, mister. Did you tell them to stay in the car? Sure I did, he said. I'm not crazy. Well, you could have proved me. What's your name? I asked him. For the sheriff. Lumley. Gerard Lumley. He started in with Tukey again, and I went across to the telephone. I picked it up and heard nothing but dead silence. I hit the cutoff button a couple of times, still nothing. I came back. Tukey had poured Gerard Lumley another shot of brandy. This was going down a lot smoother. Was he out? Tukey asked. Phone's dead. God damn it, Tukey says, and we look back at each other. Outside, the wind gusted up, throwing snow against the windows. Lumley looked from Tukey to me and back again. Well, haven't either one of you got a car? He asked. The anxiety was back in his voice. They gotta run the engine to run the heater, and I had a quarter tank of gas, and it took me an hour and a half to... Look, will you just answer me? He stood up and grabbed Tukey's shirt. Mister, Tukey said, I think your hands just ran from your brains there. Lumley looked at his hands, at Tukey, then dropped him. Maine, he hissed. Sort of made it sound like a dirty word for someone's mother. All right, he said, what's the nearest gas station? They must have a tow truck. Nearest gas station's in Falmouth Central, I said. That's 3 miles down from here. Thanks, he said, a bit sarcastic, and headed for the door, buttoning his coat. Won't be open, though, I added. He turned back slowly and looked at us. What are you talking about, old man? He's trying to tell you that the station in the center belongs to Billy Larrabee, and Billy's out driving the plow, you damned fool, Tukey said patiently. Now, why don't you come back here, sit down before you bust your gut? He came back, looked dazed and frightened. Are you telling me that you can't... that there isn't... I ain't telling you nothing, Tukey says. You're doing all the telling, and if you stop for a minute, we could think this over. What's this town, Jerusalem's lot? He asked. Why was the road drifted in and no lights on anywhere? I said, Jerusalem's lot's been burned out 2 years back. And they never rebuilt? He looked like he didn't believe it. It appears that way, I said, and looked at Tukey. What are we going to do about this? Can't leave him out there, he said. I got closer to him. Lumley had wandered out to look at the window in the night sky. What if they got at? I asked. That may be, he said, but we don't know it for sure. I got my Bible on the shelf. You still wear your Pope's medal? I pulled out the crucifix of my shirt to show him. I was born and raised Congregational. Most folks around the lot wear something, a crucifix, St. Christopher's medal, a rosary, anything. Because 2 years ago, in the span of one dark October, the lot went bad. Sometimes late at night, there were a few regulars drawn up around Tukey's fire. People just talk over. Talk around it is more like the truth. You see, people in the lot started to disappear. First a few, then a few more, then a whole slew. The schools closed, the town stood empty for most a year. A few people moved in, mostly damn fools from out of state, like this fine specimen here. Drawn by the low property value, I suppose, but they didn't last. A lot of them moved out in a month or two after they'd moved in. The others, well, they disappeared. Then the town burned flat. It was at the end of a long, dry fall. They figured it started over at the Marston house on the hill overlooking Joyner Avenue, but no one knows how it started, not to this day. It burned out of control for 3 days. After that, for a time, things were better, and then it started again. I only heard the word vampires once. A crazy pulp truck driver named Richie Messina from over Freeport Way was in Tukey's that night, pretty well liquored up. Jesus Christ, the stampeder roars, standing up about 9 feet tall in his woolen pants, plaid shirt, leather-topped boots. "Are you all so damned afraid to say it out? Vampires! That's what you're all thinking, ain't it? Jesus, jumped up Christ in a chariot-driven sidecar, just like a bunch of kids scared of the movies. You know what's down there in Salem's Lot. Want me to tell you? Do ya?" "Do tell, Richie," Tookie said. It got real quiet in the bar. You can hear the fire popping and outside drift of November rain coming down in the dark. "You've got the floor." "What you got over there is your basic wild dog pack," Richie Messina tells us. "That's what you got. That and a lot of old women who love a spook story. Why, for $80 I'll go up there and spend the night in what's left of that haunted house you're all so worried about. Well, what about it? Anyone gonna put it up?" But nobody would. Richie was a loudmouth and a mean drunk, and nobody was going to shed any tears at his wake, but none of us wanted to see him go into Salem's Lot after dark. "Be screwed to the bunch of you," Richie said. "I've got my 410 in the trunk of my Chevy, and that'll stop anything in Falmouth, Cumberland, or Jerusalem's Lot. And that's where I'm going." He slammed out of the bar, and no one said a word for a while. Then Lamont Henry said, real quiet, "I think that's the last time anyone's going to see Richie Messina." And Lamont, raised to be a Methodist from his mother's knee, crossed himself. "He'll sober up and change his mind," Tookie said. But he sounded uneasy. "He'll be back by closing time, making it out like it was a joke." But Lamont had it right on that one, because no one ever saw Richie again. His wife told the state cops that she had gone to Florida to beat a collection agency, and that you could tell the truth of the thing in her eyes. Sick, scared eyes. Not long after she moved away to Rhode Island, maybe she thought Richie was going to come back for her some dark night. And I'm not man enough to say what he might have done. Now, Tookie was looking at me. I was looking at Tookie as I stuffed my crucifix back in my shirt. I never felt so old or so scared in my whole life. Tookie said again, "We can't just leave him out there, Booth." "Yeah, I know." We looked at each other for a moment longer, and then he reached out and gripped my shoulder. "You're a good man, Booth." That was enough to buck me up some. It seems like when you pass 70, people start forgetting that you're a man or that you ever were. Tookie walked over to Lumley and said, "I've got a 4-wheel drive Scout. I'll get it out." "For God's sakes, man, why didn't you say so before?" He had whirled around from the window and was staring angrily at Tookie. "Why have you had to spend the last 10 minutes beating around the bush?" Tookie said, very softly, "Mister, you shut your jaw. And if you get the urge to open it again, you remember who made that turn on an unplowed road in the middle of a goddamn blizzard." He started to say something and then shut his mouth. Thick color had risen in his cheeks. Tookie went out and got the Scout from the garage. I felt under the bar for his chrome flask and filled it with some brandy. Figured we'd both need it before the night was over. Maine blizzard. Ever been out in one? The snow comes flying so thick and fine it looks like sand and sounds like it beating on the side of your car or pickup. You don't want to use your high beams because it'll reflect off the snow and you can't see it 10 feet in front of you. With the low beams on, you can maybe see about 15 feet. But I can live with the snow. It's the wind I don't like. When it picks up and begins to howl, driving the snow into 100 weird flying shapes and sounding like all the hate and pain and fear in the world. There's a death in the throat of a snowstorm wind. White death. And maybe something beyond death. That's no sound to hear when you're tucked up all cozy in your bed with the shutters bolted and the doors locked. It's that much worse if you're driving, and you're driving into Salem's Lot. "Hurry up a little, can't you?" Lumley asked. I said, "For a man who came in half frozen, you're in one hell of a hurry to end up walking again." He gave me a resentful, baffled look and didn't say anything else. We were moving up the highway at a steady 25 miles per hour. It was hard to believe that Billy Larrabee had just plowed this stretch an hour ago. Another 2 inches had it covered, and it was drifted in. The strongest gust of wind rocked the Scout on her springs. The headlights showed a swirling white nothing up ahead of us. We hadn't met a single car. About 10 minutes later, Lumley gasped, "Hey, what's that?" He was pointing out the side of the car. I had been looking dead ahead. I turned, but it was a shade too late. I thought I could see some sort of slumped-over form fading back from the car, back into the snow, but it could have been what I imagined. "What was that, a deer?" I asked. "I guess so," he said, sounding shaky. "But its eyes, they looked red." He looked at me. Is that how deer's eyes look at night?" He sounded almost as if he were pleading. "They could look like anything," I said, thinking it might be true. "But I've seen a lot of deer at night from a lot of cars, and never saw any of their eyes reflect red." Tukey didn't say anything. About 15 minutes later, we came to a place where the snowbank on the right of the road was so high because the plows were supposed to raise their blades when they got through this intersection. "This looks like where we turned," Lumley said, not sounding too sure about it. "I don't see the sign." "This is it," Tukey answered. He didn't sound like himself at all. "You can just see the top of the signpost." "Oh, sure." Lumley sounded relieved. "Listen, Mr. Tooklander, I'm sorry about being short with you back there. I was cold and worried and calling myself 200 kinds of fool, but anyway, I just want to thank you both." "Don't thank Booth and me until we've got them both back in this car," Tukey said. He put the Scout in four-wheel drive and slammed his way through the snowbank onto Jointner Ave, which goes through the lot and out to 295. Snow flew up the mud guards. The rear end tried to brake a little bit, but Tukey's been driving through the snow since Hector was a pup. He jockeyed it a bit, talked to it, and on we went. The headlights picked up a bare indication of a tire track from time to time. This one's made by Lumley's car that would have disappeared again. Lumley, leaning forward, looked for his car, and all at once Tukey said, "Mr. Lumley." "What?" He turned to look at Tukey. "People around these parts are superstitious about Salem's Lot," Tukey said, sounding easy enough, but I could see the deep lines of strain around his mouth, and the way his eyes kept moving from side to side. "If your people are in the car, why, that's fine. We'll pack them up and go back to my place, and tomorrow, when the storm's over, Billy will be glad to yank your car out of the snowbank." "But if they're not in the car," "Not in the car," Lumley broke in sharply. "Why wouldn't they be in the car?" "If they're not in the car," Tukey goes on, not answering, "we're going to turn around and drive right back to Falmouth Center and whistle for the sheriff. Makes no sense to go wallowing around at night in a snowstorm anyway, does it? They'll be in the car. Where else would they be?" I said, "One other thing, Mr. Lumley. If we should see anybody, we're not going to talk to them. Not even if they talk to us. Do you understand?" Very slowly, Lumley says, "Just what are these superstitions?" Before I can say anything, God alone knows what I would have said, Tukey broke in. "We're here." I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of tonight's reading of Stephen King's One for the Road. Please join us again next week for part 2 and the conclusion of our story. Until next time, dear mortal, stay scared.